So, dear friends, it is a true privilege and pleasure today to have Professor Steven Pinker with us, who among many other accolades was named in 2004 by Time magazine as one of the most 100 influential people in the world. And like I say, that's just one among many titles and attributes and accolades Professor Pinker has received over the decades of incredible research and scientific insight and exploration. And we are deeply honored and privileged to have him with us, and want to first and foremost begin by expressing our appreciation to you, Professor Pinker, for sharing of your precious time and insight with us. But let's touch on the topic that brings us here today. And we are here, of course, to explore some of your fascinating and revolutionary findings into the state of human affairs, human progress, world progress, and what makes your book, your recent book, and many of your talks, including the most lovely and wonderful and both entertaining and stimulating debate, the monk debate with Malcolm Gladwell, Alain de Botton, and Mr. Ridley, so unique is that it's not, your optimism is not based on wishful thinking or naivete, but rather science and data. And that's what I think is so interesting and unique about what I would call perhaps your scientific optimism. And yet we find, it seems, that there's a lot of sort of, I wouldn't say opposition, but resistance to those findings. And as you accurately pointed out, chimpanzees, based on Hans Rosling, chimpanzees are more likely to get the answers about human progress randomly by picking bananas better than humans are. I know that in this country, they did an article asking about human progress and how many people believe the world is getting better, and only 5% of Brits feel the world is getting better. And in the US, which is far more optimistic, the number is 6%. So obviously there's some resistance, and I wanted to open with your reflections, some of your reflections about the state of the world in general times, but especially in today's times, where some could argue or perhaps challenge some of your findings and ask whether in fact you still maintain that we are marching towards a very bright future, or perhaps this has somehow changed or made more nuanced some of your views on progress.
Well, forget March and forget a bright future. Enlightenment Now and the Better Angels of Our Nature presented data on what we have accomplished so far. As you noted in discussing Hans Rosling's Ignorance Project, the message that I wanted to convey was not one of optimism, seeing the glass as half full, as opposed to half empty, but just looking at the glass. Most people are ignorant as to the contents of the glass. It's not a question of putting a positive spin on the fact. It's a question of knowing the facts. Most people are completely ignorant of the fact that extreme poverty has declined by 75% just in the last 30 years. Most people have no idea that interstate wars are rare, perhaps obsolescent, that deaths in war are down by a factor of more than 20 since the late 40s and early 50s, to say nothing of the Second World War. Most people don't know that 80% of the world's population under the age of 25 is literate for the first time in history. So these are facts. There's no magical process that made them happen. There's no such thing as a force called progress. Progress occurs to the extent that we recognize problems and use our ingenuity to try to solve them, but problems are inevitable. And the fact that we have made progress is not a magical shield against problems ever happening again, including pandemics. If anyone conceives of progress as saying that we'll never have a pandemic again, that would be wizardry. That would be that would not be progress as it has taken place. We know, as we've been reminded 3 weeks ago during the Passover Seder, that plagues are older than civilization. We have immune systems because pathogens and parasites are part of the bargain of being alive. If you're a living organism, you are this big, yummy mound of cheesecake, tempting to little organisms who would like nothing better than to feast on your body. We've evolved defenses, including our immune system, including sexual reproduction. The reason that males exist and sex exists is so that our offspring are not clones of ourselves and won't be sitting ducks to any germs that have evolved to crack our molecular locks and keys. But humans, in addition to sex and an immune system, have another biological adaptation that we can use to fight back. And that is our reason, our cognitive processes, culminating in science, the fact that we can try to figure out how the world works, we can identify the things that make us miserable, do our best to figure out what causes them, what can combat them. And that's why we have profited in the past from advances in public health, sanitation, hand washing, insect control, medical advances, antibiotics, vaccination, blood transfusions, and have more than doubled our lifespan in the last 150 years. And it seems extremely likely that for all of the tragedy and deaths, some of them needless from the pandemic, it will be brought under control because of human ingenuity. First, because of public health measures like distancing, in the intermediate term by testing and contact tracing and supported isolation, and in the longer term by antivirals and vaccines.
Yes, so you were saying that at that time there was so much influenza during this epidemic itself. The best scientists were working on it, but nobody discovered what the actual virus was that was causing the epidemic. But now it took 2 weeks to identify the correct virus sequence and the entire genome and develop reliable tests. What are your thoughts about what are your thoughts about some type of balanced perspective, if you will, historical perspective on COVID-19? Obviously, it has caused a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of unknowns. What would you offer in terms of some sobering, maybe data-based or historical insights to provide some measure of perspective or balance?
Well, I think you've already identified them, together with the fact that disease is a part of life and has been with us since we were single-celled organisms. Even bacteria get infected with viruses. Our newfound ability to not only identify, well, first of all, to know that there is a pathogen, that is, as opposed to blaming disease on divine retribution, evil spirits, miasmas, Jews poisoning wells. We knew early on that this was going to be a virus, and not only was the virus identified, but as you mentioned, actually its genome sequenced in a matter of weeks. That's just astonishing. And the fact that despite the prevalence of superstition and magical thinking, the vast majority of people really do recognize that the only way we're going to get out of this is to pay attention to the best epidemiology, to distance ourselves, wash our hands, cover our faces, ideally test and trace, and then develop antivirals and vaccines. That doesn't mean that this isn't going, it already has been a horrific tragedy. It will get worse before it gets better, but we have every reason to believe that it will get better. Ideally, what we would do is use this as a learning experience and put into place an infrastructure that would make us more prepared next time, because there will be a next time. That is, just as after a set of horrifying fires in the late 19th and early 20th century, cities responded by setting up fire departments and fire drills and sprinkler systems and emergency exits and emergency lighting, and set up fire departments that thankfully are putting themselves out of a job. Most fire departments now put out a fire every other year. We don't shut them down because we are aware enough of the risk of fires that we keep them around precisely to prevent small outbreaks from burning down entire cities as they used to do. If we're rational about this is no guarantee that we will be. It's going to depend on leadership, and we know that there have been big failures of leadership, not least in my adopted country. But what we ought to do is have the equivalent of a fire department for pandemics, networks of early detection and tracing, stockpiles of protective medical equipment, facilities that can develop, test, and manufacture vaccines and antivirals on short notice, and so on. It is a fact of human psychology that we react to things when they are vividly present in our recent memories. And so there is a hope that we can, that's the effect that this experience will have. We know that we did it probably in the wrong way after 9/11 in the United States, where in response, in contrast to COVID-19, the threat of terrorism was actually rather trivial when it comes to how many lives are lost. Nonetheless, an entire department was at the level of the cabinet was set up, Homeland Security, and two very questionable wars. Ideally, we would have a response at least that energetic this time.
You know, it's very interesting because a lot of what you're saying echoes what I heard Bill Gates speak about. And I mean, for those who aren't familiar, in 2015, he gave a TED Talk and was talking really about how the next big deal, the next big threat or danger to society would be a global pandemic. And when he was interviewed recently, he said very much what you said, that in a sense, what we're doing now is we're really preparing ourselves for the future. And we're really ensuring the safety and security of the next generation by way of the alacrity in which we are now going to be, hopefully, shifting posture and resources from a government and political and medical perspective to ensure that we're better prepared for pandemics going forward. Why do you think society isn't thinking in those terms, or those at the highest levels of government don't often think about the longer term potential threats and issues when, you know, in a sense, those are the things that can really bring the world to a standstill as COVID-19 has?
Well, the incentives built into our political process militate against long-term thinking. Mm-hmm. A politician who says, I'm going to raise your taxes now so that we're better prepared for a pandemic that will hypothetically happen sometime in the next few decades, I don't know when, that's not a ticket to being reelected. And we need a political and a journalistic infrastructure that makes the foreseeable future more palpable. And again, this is not, as Gates emphasized, and probably every global public health expert, this is not a weird and unpredictable black swan event. It was only a matter of time before it would come. It's not, the mechanism of a virus is not exotic or hypothetical. We know they can happen, but the electoral cycle and the nature of journalism don't align the incentives with the political system. We have the coverage, say, for terrorism and the coverage for epidemics are way out of whack. They should have been exactly reversed.
Mm-hmm. So I think it comes down to one of the basic hypotheses that you put forth, if I understand correctly, which is we should be thinking about reality more from a data-driven or data-based model rather than emotionalism, which is unfortunately a lot of the reactivity that happens. For example, because our sense of reality is very skewed oftentimes by media or by the reality or worldview that's curated for us by our intellectual diet of media. I think it was you or someone I read said a fascinating quote, which is that last year alone, 140 million planes landed safely. And yet the average person that didn't make it. That's a terrible distortion of reality in people's perception. And if that takes place at the highest levels, people are looking at the wrong things and spending resources on the wrong product.
But yes, there are built-in distortions in the very nature of news. This isn't because of a nefarious motive among journalists to maximize clicks and engagement, although that factors into it as well. But it's in the nature of news that if it's event-driven, then we get a distorted view because it's sudden bad things that tend to become news. Good things tend to creep up a few percentage points a year and never make a headline because they don't happen suddenly on a Thursday in October. This is in addition to the fact that, as we know from our taste for violent entertainment, going back to the Hebrew Bible and before, gruesome violent events are emotionally gripping, and the news satisfies that curiosity, as well as being far too driven by events. So not only good news that creeps up on us a few percentage points a year, like the decline of extreme poverty, the decline of war, but also hypothetical threats in the future, such as pandemics, which are, if they haven't happened yet, then they aren't news. So we do need much more of a data orientation in our educational system, in our journalistic world, in our politics, in the conventional wisdom of intellectuals. A lot of our discourse is driven by narratives, anecdotes, scenarios, plausible opinions. But we should really make up for our own natural indifference to data by cultivating it as a value in understanding our world.
It was very interesting because in the debate itself, I found that your side, your team was very data driven, and the other team was anecdotal, be it Geneva or flowers or whatnot. It tended toward more anecdotal, philosophical, psychological, presentation rather than data-driven presentation. And that was my little takeaway from it. And perhaps that's the reason, one of the reasons that you actually won that debate, which I thought was marvelous, and I would encourage all of our viewers to watch.
By a thread. I mean, and that debate was in part preparation for my book, Enlightenment Now, which came out a few years later. I think you're right that there is, that any credence that one gives in progress has to come from data, because if you simply read the papers, as long as bad events haven't disappeared from the face of the earth, which they never will, there will always be enough disasters to fill the papers. And it's only by looking at data where the denominator of the fraction is the number of opportunities for bad things to happen, including the opportunities where they don't happen, that one can really appreciate the progress that's taken place. I think the other intellectual element that went into that debate was I think a contrast between a humanistic worldview that says that the ultimate moral value is the lives led, the flourishing, the reduction of suffering of individual people worldwide. And the moral value of data is that it treats all lives as having equal value. It's dehumanizing in the sense that people are turned into numbers. On the other hand, it is also the ultimate egalitarianism in that all people are turned into numbers, and the ones that are close to us, that look like us, that are in our clan, are not privileged if your numbers are all of humanity. Now, there's a contrasting view. You might say, well, maximizing human flourishing, who could be against that? But there is a view, and Alain de Botton expressed it, that the ultimate value is greatness, is heroism, artistic genius. And he said, I don't know how serious this was or whether it was a debating point. He said, I come from Switzerland, one of the world's most prosperous and healthy and peaceful and safe countries, but things aren't so great. I mean, there are a lot of people who've never read Proust and don't experience the finest things in life, and people get lonely, they get bored, even in Switzerland. But there is among many artists and intellectuals the idea that the lives of ordinary people, of billions of people who are well-fed, who have children, who survive, who bring up their children, who see them get married, all of the ordinary pleasures of life, that isn't really what matters. What really matters is Proust or Napoleon or greatness. And this is a view associated with Friedrich Nietzsche. Unfortunately, it's popular among many artists and intellectuals, perhaps because it valorizes the achievements of artists and intellectuals and other heroes over the lives lived by everyday men, women, and children.
But what you argue, Stephen, there's an interesting question that, globalization is obviously a very big force for good in so many respects. But would some might argue that the quick spread of this particular pandemic and potentially going forward the same has to do perhaps with globalization and other such trends that have brought the world in closer proximity. The point of my question is that while on the 10 parameters you choose to highlight in the book, the world is progressing, wouldn't the counter argument be, yes, it is, but also the new challenges we might be facing are changing and could be potentially more disastrous than old problems we're working to solve?
Well, there are challenges that we are not on track to meeting, climate change being the foremost. There are habitat destruction and loss of species is another one. Although there is, it's not that we've made no progress there, but we made progress in some places and not so much in others. In general, I argue that what recognition of these unsolved problems ought to do is lead us to lay out roadmaps to solving them. What do we have to do to solve the problem of climate change without relinquishing all of the benefits that energy and industrialization have given us, such as the decline of disease and early death and the multiplication of opportunities to enjoy each other's company and enjoy the natural and cultural world? I mean, I think the solution has to be to develop new sources of carbon-free energy, to have changes in land use, in the manufacture of carbon-intensive substances like concrete and steel and fertilizer, to treat this as the next frontier of problems that we must now solve, having inherited the problems that the past solutions bequeathed us.
Do you think that there's been a trajectory towards globalization, a thrust that's been quickening and expanding? Yes, some could argue, and actually Yuval does, that some of the political movements of late have been the backlash towards globalization and the reintroduction of nationalization, whatever, be it Brexit or Make America Great Again, etc. The rise of certain right ideological or political movements will slow the forward progress towards globalization. And that's one question. Negative could that be, or will that be, if many of the current problems the world is facing can only be solved through global cooperation, for example, technological disruption or cybersecurity issues, terrorism and pandemics, etc., etc.
Oh, indeed, I agree with that, and that the forces of authoritarianism, nationalism, and reactionary populism are indeed threats to these frontiers of progress, for all the reasons that you mentioned. The case for what I consider Enlightenment values, humanism, cosmopolitanism, liberalism, have to be reinforced because they're not particularly psychologically natural, and there is an inevitable backlash to the inroads that they make. Some of them ideological or self-interested, the people whose interests are threatened by the rise of women, of minorities. Some of it legitimate, the elimination of manufacturing jobs without a rapid replacement. Sometimes the rapid absorption of immigrant communities who don't assimilate and adopt the liberal values of their host countries. There are various things that can trigger these backlashes, and if the backlash strengthens and dominates, then it could push back against this progress, as we've seen again in the United States, where our populist president has clearly not risen to the scientific challenge of combating a pandemic in the way that a more scientifically literate leader would.
For sure. So one question is, how do you envision the world changing after this pandemic sort of passes, as it were? How do you envision government changing? How do you envision the market changing? How do you envision education changing due to the current situation and when it passes?
It's particularly hard to predict because our current revolution, our lifestyle is just so salient to us that it's very hard to imagine life getting back to normal. So the question is, if in 2 years we do have vaccines and have tamed the pandemic and life goes back to normal, how much forgetting or how much just settling back into the old normal will there be? I think that's hard to predict. I think some things are predictable. I think there will be far fewer professional face-to-face meetings. Once the ice is broken on video conferencing, people realize that an awful lot of the time when people put their bodies into steel vehicles and move them miles or thousands of miles to transact business that wasn't particularly pleasant in the first place, you could do just as well by Zoom. And a good thing is that there'll be fewer of these unnecessary meetings. Of course, people will still want to see each other in the flesh for all the obvious reasons, but an awful lot of our business meetings and perhaps even lectures and interviews were needlessly expensive in terms of dollars, time, and carbon. Probably our social rituals might change. There might be an end to the handshake and the kissing of non-intimates. Although, again, it's hard to predict. With any social convention, there's a lot of just, if you'll pardon the expression, some things go, as we say, viral, by which I mean to say no authority legislates them, but they catch on or don't in ways that are hard to predict. There ought to be greater national and global cooperation for some of the reasons that you mentioned, namely that there are some problems that are just inherently global. Viruses don't care about national boundaries. Whether that will happen depends in part on how resilient authoritarian populism turns out to be. And one hopes concretely that there'll just be measures in place that specifically deal with public health emergencies in the way that fire departments are set up to deal with fires.
Fantastic. You know, Stephen, there's that great Jewish joke of the difference between a Jewish pessimist and a Jewish optimist. The Jewish pessimist says, get any worse, and the Jewish optimist says, yes, they can.
Very good. It's a joke I appreciate.
Or one of my favorites of the waitress going through the restaurant asking patrons, excuse me, is everything all right? Is everything all right? And then sees two Jewish patrons and asks, is anything all right? Is anything all right? So Stephen, my last question, has two parts. One is, can you share with us some of the findings you've recently come across that you haven't included in your recent book? Some of the really exciting findings you are coming across in other areas, or even updating some of the ones you did write about. And that will lead to the next question, the final question, which is, are you working on what's your next project? Are you working on a book? What you're always engaged in deep exploration. What's on the front burner?
Okay. Yeah, in terms of other areas of progress, in the United States, despite some of the horrors of the casual racism expressed by our president and his followers, racism continues to decline, including implicit bias, as measured by subtle measures such as the implicit association test by my colleague Mahzarin Banaji. Let's see, climate, there's not a whole lot of good news to report in terms of actually declining emissions, but there is good news in terms of carbon-free energy technologies, including fusion, which was always derided as the energy source that's 30 years in the future and always will be. And there have been some impressive advances in fusion. Extreme poverty continues to decline. That is obviously going to be at least a temporary reversal because of the pandemic just in the last 3 months. But overall, that trajectory has continued. In terms of what my next project will be, over the last 5 months, I've taught a new course at Harvard called Rationality, on the tools of rationality like probability, logic, correlation and causation, game theory, statistical decision theory, the psychology of rationality, our heuristics and biases and how we overcome them, and applications of rationality to domains like evidence-based policy, evidence-based medicine, effective altruism in philanthropy, and other applications. I put the lectures online. They got such a nice response that I've decided to turn that into my next book, which will, tentative title is Rationality, What It Is, Why It's Scarce, How to Get More.
Wow. Listen, Professor Pinker, we can sit and talk forever, but I do know you're on a very tight schedule. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insights, and thank our viewers for joining us for this very special Enlightenment Now session with Professor Steven Pinker. We want to bless you and yours with continued good health and prosperity and serenity. And please, God, let us hope and pray that as we will learn from this particular period and take its lessons to heart, as you so eloquently argued, to bring our world to a better state, to a more united state, and hopefully move our societies and our reality forward one step at a time. Thank you so much, Professor Pinker. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate that, your blessing, and I thank all of you for listening. I wish you all peace, health, and good fortunes.
And on a personal note, Professor, when you're next in London, although it sounds like you're going to be diminishing your travel potentially, but if you are here in the future, our community would be deeply honored to welcome you, to host you, and to look after you while you're here.
I will accept. Thank you so much.
All the best. Be well.